Hello. This story I'm about to share with you isn't just about a woman's tragic loss, but about the terrifying, almost impossible way she found what she thought was gone forever. It's a story that proves the universe has a cruel sense of humor, often revealing the truth in the most mundane, unsuspecting moments. A truth so painful and so deeply buried that it could only be unearthed by the simple, fragile flutter of a newspaper page. Our story begins in a quiet, forgotten corner of a small town in Massachusetts, with a woman named Eleanor Vance. Eleanor wasn't a hero or a detective or a character in a thriller novel. She was an ordinary, graying woman with hands that smelled of old paper and dust, a librarian who lived a life of quiet routine. Her world was a predictable, gentle rhythm of shelving books, watering her small garden, and making tea in the afternoon. But behind the calm facade of her life was an emptiness, a chasm of grief that had swallowed her whole 20 years ago. A grief she carried not for a person she knew, but for a life she never got to see grow. 20 years ago, a devastating tragedy struck Eleanor and her husband, Martin. Their baby girl, born prematurely, was diagnosed with a severe and incurable condition. The doctors, with grave faces and somber tones, delivered the news that a life so fragile couldn't possibly survive. The little girl, a tiny, helpless bundle, passed away in the sterile silence of the hospital nursery just 2 days after her birth. Eleanor and Martin were handed a death certificate and a small, ceramic urn, the final, devastating proof of their loss. They named her Grace. Over the years, Eleanor visited the small memorial plaque they had placed in a quiet park, a simple stone bench under an old oak tree, with her name etched upon it. It was her private sanctuary, a place to mourn a future that had been stolen from her. The grief had long since calcified into a dull, constant ache. It was a part of her now like a phantom limb. The day everything changed was like any other. A pale, anemic sun struggled to break through the morning haze. Eleanor had just finished her morning shift at the library, her mind already drifting to the mundane task of a grocery run. As she was leaving, a stack of the local free weekly paper, the Town Crier, sat on a low table by the door. She rarely took one. The news was always a predictable parade of school bake sales and town council meetings. But on this day, for a reason she couldn't explain, she picked one up. A small, almost imperceptible tremor of curiosity. She went to her car, tossed the paper onto the passenger seat, and drove to the market. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of picking out produce and checking off her list. When she got home, she collapsed onto her sofa, a cup of Earl Grey steaming in her hands. The newspaper, forgotten, lay on the coffee table. It was only when she reached for a coaster that her eyes, almost by accident, fell upon the front page. There, in a small human interest story tucked into the corner, was a photo. A full-color photograph of a young woman, no older than 25, laughing as she held a paintbrush. The headline read, "Local artist Lily Hayes brings color to the community." It was a completely unremarkable piece, the kind of fluff that filled small-town papers. But something in the photo snagged Eleanor's attention. Not the woman's face, not her bright eyes, but something far more specific. A subtle, butterfly-shaped birthmark on the side of her neck, half hidden by a cascade of vibrant red hair. A birthmark that was a perfect, heartbreaking mirror image of the one on her own neck. A birthmark so unique, so incredibly rare, that the doctor who delivered her had commented on it, saying he'd never seen one like it. A cold, visceral wave of shock washed over her. Eleanor's hands began to shake, sloshing tea over the rim of her mug. Her mind, so used to its orderly routine, began to scream. No, can't be. It was a cruel, impossible coincidence. The photo was a digital image, likely edited. The birthmark was probably just a trick of the light. She was a grieving woman, seeing things that weren't there. But the feeling, that undeniable magnetic pull, was too strong to ignore. She lifted the paper closer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She read the article, her eyes blurring over the words. Lily Hayes, adopted as an infant, raised in Boston, a celebrated painter. Everything seemed to fit into a neat, respectable box. A box that had nothing to do with her. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow with terrifying speed. She kept looking at the photo, tracing the birthmark with her finger. It was the same, the exact same. And then, as if the universe hadn't dealt her enough cruelty, she looked at the young woman's eyes. They were the same deep, oceanic blue as her late husband's. Martin's eyes, a shade she had loved more than any other. Eleanor had always been told that genetics were unpredictable, a cosmic lottery. But the combination of the eyes and the birthmark, it was a mathematical impossibility to be a coincidence. It was a fingerprint, a sign, a whisper from a ghost. She put the paper down, her hands trembling uncontrollably. The orderly world she had built around her, the one she had painstakingly constructed from the rubble of her grief, began to crack. The truth felt like a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. What did it mean? Could she have been lied to? Could her daughter, her Grace, have survived? The thought was a double-edged sword. It brought a flash of blinding, intoxicating hope, followed immediately by a wave of nauseating, black dread. If Grace was alive, then the past 20 years of her life, her grief, her quiet mourning at the stone bench, it had all been a lie, a monstrous, unforgivable lie. The question echoed in the silent room, a chilling whisper that would not be silenced. Who would do such a thing? And more terrifyingly, why? Eleanor stared at the smiling face in the newspaper, a stranger who carried a piece of her soul, and knew that her life, as she knew it, was over. The night that followed was a waking nightmare. Eleanor couldn't sleep. The image of the girl in the newspaper, Lily Hayes, was burned into her mind. The paper lay on her coffee table like a ticking bomb, the front page staring at her. It felt like a malevolent entity, a harbinger of a truth so dark it might shatter her. She tried to tell herself it was just a strange coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. But the conviction, the primal, maternal certainty deep in her bones, wouldn't allow for such an easy escape. She spent the entire night huddled on her sofa, surrounded by shadows, her mind racing. By morning, the denial had faded, replaced by a cold, searing rage. A rage so pure it had its own heat, burning through her grief and fear. Someone had lied to her. Someone had stolen her daughter. The calm, predictable life she had built was a carefully constructed facade, a prison built on a foundation of lies. She had to know the truth. She had to find out what really happened 20 years ago. The first logical step was to go back to the source. The hospital. Eleanor dressed in a simple blouse and skirt, her movements purposeful and sharp. She drove to the St. Jude's Hospital, the place where she had lost everything. The building was a sterile, impersonal monument to medical progress, but to Eleanor it was a tomb, a place where her future had been buried. The hospital's records department was a soulless, fluorescent-lit room. A stern-faced woman with a name tag that read Brenda sat behind a counter, her eyes suspicious and bored. Eleanor, her voice trembling but firm, requested her daughter's birth and death records from 20 years ago. Brenda gave her a long, appraising look. 20 years is a long time, ma'am. These records are archived. We need a written request, a court order, sometimes even. Brenda's voice trailed off, her suspicion hardening into outright stonewalling. Eleanor felt the first wave of a massive, bureaucratic wall rising before her. It was as if they were actively trying to hide something. The hospital records were supposedly confidential, but the way Brenda spoke, the dismissive wave of her hand, it felt like a deliberate act of obstruction. She left the hospital with nothing but a pamphlet on how to file a formal records request. But the encounter had only solidified her resolve. The hospital's cold dismissal felt like a confirmation of her worst fears. They were hiding something. The next step was less official, more desperate. She went to the town's historical society, a small, dusty building run by a sweet, elderly woman who remembered Eleanor from school. The woman, whose name was Helen, a gossip of the best kind, was a walking encyclopedia of the town's history. Eleanor explained she was doing some family genealogy research and asked to see the old town records. Helen, bless her heart, gave Eleanor access to the archives, a treasure trove of forgotten secrets. Eleanor spent hours sifting through dusty newspapers from 20 years ago, looking for any mention of her daughter's passing. There was nothing. No obituary, no death notice, no mention of the tragedy that had consumed her. She found her own wedding announcement, her husband's high school graduation photo, but absolutely nothing about the death of their infant daughter. This was impossible. A death certificate existed, a name, a date. Why wasn't it in the public record? Her grief had been so all-consuming that she had never thought to check. Her husband, Martin, had handled all the arrangements. She had trusted him implicitly. A new, horrifying suspicion began to take root. Was her husband involved in this? He had always been so private about their grief, so reticent to talk about Grace. She had always attributed it to his male stoicism, his way of coping. But what if it was guilt? Martin had passed away 5 years ago from a heart attack, leaving her alone with her memories. The thought that he, the one person she had trusted completely, could have been a part of this monstrous lie was almost too much to bear. Eleanor went back to her house, her mind reeling. The newspaper with Lily's face was still on the coffee table. She needed answers that the outside world couldn't provide. She went into the study, a room she had kept meticulously preserved since Martin's death. It was a museum of his life. His old armchair, his bookshelves, his mahogany desk. She had never touched the desk drawers. It felt like an invasion of his privacy. But now that respect was gone, replaced by a desperate need for the truth. She pulled out the top drawer, then the next, her hands moving with a frantic energy. There was nothing but old bills, office supplies, and forgotten memos. Her heart sank. She was about to give up when she noticed a subtle seam on the side of the bottom drawer. It was a hidden compartment, a small, shallow space just under the wood. She pried it open with a letter opener. Inside, there was a worn, leather-bound journal and a single, faded photograph. The photograph was of her, pregnant, beaming, her hand resting on her swollen belly, and standing beside her, looking directly at the camera with a strained, almost pained smile, was Martin. The journal lay open to a single, stark entry, dated just a few days after their daughter was born. The words, written in Martin's familiar scrawl, were simple, direct, and devastating. "I did it. The money is wired to the account. It's done. We'll tell her Grace passed away. She can never know. For her own good. And for mine." Eleanor read the words over and over, her mind unable to comprehend the full weight of the betrayal. Her husband, her Martin, had been complicit in this. But why? What had he done? And who was we? The mystery had just deepened into an abyss. The discovery of the journal entry was a sucker punch, a betrayal so profound it eclipsed the pain of her supposed loss. The man she had loved, the man she had grieved for, had actively orchestrated the lie that had defined the past 20 years of her life. The journal held other entries, fragmented and cryptic, hinting at a web of debt, a desperate financial situation, and a powerful, anonymous benefactor. The name Mr. Sterling appeared repeatedly, a cold and ominous signature on her family's tragedy. But the journal was maddeningly incomplete. Martin had been a man of few words, and his entries were more emotional notes than a clear confession. Still, the truth, however incomplete, gave Eleanor a new direction. The hospital, the public records, they were all dead ends. The answers weren't out there. They were with Lily. Eleanor knew she had to find her, not just for a reunion, but for the truth. She found Lily's studio address in the newspaper article. She drove there not to confront her, not yet, but just to see her, to confirm for herself that this was real, that Lily was not a ghost but a living, breathing person. Eleanor sat in her car across the street from the art gallery where Lily worked. She watched people go in and out, her heart a drumbeat against her ribs. And then there she was, Lily. She walked out of the gallery, carrying a canvas, her fiery red hair catching the afternoon sun. She was beautiful, vibrant, full of a life Eleanor had been told was extinguished 20 years ago. As she watched, a man and a woman approached Lily. They hugged her, their faces full of warmth and love. The article had mentioned her adoptive parents, the Hayes, They were a family, a real, loving, complete family. The sight filled Eleanor with a complex mixture of joy and bitter, heart-wrenching pain. Joy for the life her daughter had, and pain for the one she had been denied. The next day, Eleanor decided to take the next, terrifying step. She wasn't ready to face Lily, not until she understood everything. But the adoptive parents, they might know something. She found their address in the public records and drove to a beautiful suburban house with a manicured lawn. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she walked up to the door and rang the bell. The door was opened by the woman she had seen yesterday, a kind-faced lady with gentle eyes. "Mrs. Hayes?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I believe I know your daughter." Mrs. Hayes's face, so open and warm a moment ago, immediately clouded over with suspicion and alarm. "I'm sorry. I think you have the wrong house." She started to close the door, but Eleanor, desperate, pushed her hand against it. "Please, just a moment. I know this sounds insane, but I saw a picture of Lily in the paper, and I recognized her birthmark. She was born 20 years ago at St. Jude's Hospital. Her birth parents were Eleanor and Martin Vance. That's me and my husband. I was told she died." The door stopped closing. Mrs. Hayes's eyes, wide with disbelief and shock, suddenly filled with tears. She stepped back, beckoning Eleanor inside. "Please come in. My husband, Robert, is here." Mr. Hayes was a tall, imposing man, but his face was ashen. They sat Eleanor down, and in their living room, a truth far more twisted than she could have imagined began to unravel. They told her that they had adopted Lily 20 years ago, through a private adoption agency. They were told that Lily's biological mother was a young, unstable woman who was in a desperate situation and had chosen to give the baby up. There was no mention of a medical condition or a death. They had been told the biological mother was a teenager, unmarried, who couldn't care for the child. The adoption was rushed, and the agency had been vague on the details, but they were so desperate for a child they didn't question it. Eleanor's head was spinning. Two completely different stories. A lie was told to both of them. But whose? The Hayeses had a copy of the adoption paperwork, a faded legal document with a forged signature. The forged signature was her name. It was another dead end. But something Mr. Hayes said gave her a crucial new lead. He mentioned that the adoption agency they used was a subsidiary of the law firm that had handled her late husband's business affairs, a firm run by a man named Arthur Sterling. The name echoed in her mind. Mr. Sterling. It was the same name from Martin's journal. The cold, ominous signature. The web was beginning to connect. The hospital, the adoption agency, her husband's finances. It was all tied to this one man, Arthur Sterling, a name she had only seen in the journal, but who, it seemed, was the puppet master pulling the strings of her life's greatest tragedy. The truth, when it finally emerged, wasn't a single, cataclysmic event, but a slow, agonizing unraveling of a meticulously constructed lie. Eleanor now knew who she had to confront. The trail led directly to Arthur Sterling, the man whose name had haunted Martin's journal entries. She found his office, a towering skyscraper of polished glass and steel, a monument to wealth and power. Getting an appointment was impossible, so she did the only thing she could. She showed up unannounced. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite but bored expression, tried to send her away, but Eleanor, fueled by 2 decades of grief and a new, burning anger, refused to leave. Her voice, usually soft, was a low, steady tremor of pure resolve. Sterling himself finally emerged from his office, a man whose face was a mask of cold condescension. "Eleanor," he said, his voice laced with practiced charm. "What a surprise. I heard about Martin. So sorry for your loss. We were good friends." "You weren't friends," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "You were his business partner. And his accomplice." Sterling's mask of politeness cracked. His eyes, cold and calculating, narrowed. Eleanor, without another word, took out a copy of her daughter's birth certificate and death certificate and placed them on the table. Then, She slid over a page from Martin's journal. The entry with the name Mr. Sterling prominently featured. The story spilled out, not from Sterling, but from Eleanor, who pieced it all together. She told him about Lily Hayes, the newspaper article, the birthmark. Sterling's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of real fear. He was a man of logic and order, a master of control, and Eleanor was an unpredictable force, a woman with nothing left to lose. He tried to deny it, to dismiss her as a hysterical, grieving widow, but the evidence was too compelling. Finally, the dam broke. He confessed, not out of remorse, but out of a desperate need to contain the damage. Martin, her husband, had fallen into a devastating financial hole. He had made a series of bad investments, and he owed a powerful, dangerous group of people a fortune. Sterling, a ruthless corporate lawyer, had been hired to find a solution. The solution was as monstrous as it was simple: to sell their child. Not a simple, casual exchange, but a prearranged, high-stakes deal with a wealthy couple, the Hayes, who desperately wanted a child but couldn't have one. Sterling had orchestrated the entire thing, creating a fake death certificate and paying off a compromised doctor at St. Jude's to deliver the news that their baby had died. It was a perfect, untraceable crime. The motive wasn't malice, but cold, hard profit. Her husband had signed away their child's life for his own financial solvency. He had kept her in the dark, believing the lie, so she would never be able to expose the truth. Eleanor listened, the world around her dissolving into a hollow echo. The grief she had carried for 20 years had been a mirage. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, had not only betrayed her but had stolen her motherhood, her daughter's life. The betrayal was so complete, so incomprehensible, it was almost physically painful. But this story, this journey, wasn't about the past. It was about the future. It was about the woman in the newspaper. Eleanor left Sterling's office, a new woman. The grieving widow was gone, replaced by a mother with a single, burning purpose. She drove to Lily's studio, her hands no longer trembling with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering determination. She stood in front of the door, took a deep breath, and walked inside. Lily was there, painting, her back to the door. Eleanor didn't say a word. She just watched her for a moment, memorizing every detail. The concentration on her face, the flick of her wrist, the graceful curve of her neck with the butterfly birthmark. Lily finally turned around. Their eyes met. Lily, her face full of the kindness the newspaper had mentioned, smiled politely. "Can I help you?" Eleanor, tears finally streaming down her face, shook her head. She held out her hand. A single, faded photograph of herself, pregnant, and her husband, Martin. Lily looked at the photo, then at Eleanor, her smile slowly fading as confusion and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "I'm your mother," Eleanor said, the words a 20-year-old confession. And so, the truth, buried for 20 years under a mountain of lies and grief, finally saw the light. The story of Eleanor Vance isn't just a tale of loss and discovery. It's a terrifying testament to how far people will go to conceal a secret, and how, in the end, the most powerful force in the universe is a mother's love and the relentless pursuit of truth. It's a story that teaches us that even when the light seems completely gone, a single, small flutter of a newspaper page can be enough to tear down a fortress of lies and bring a lost child back home. If the story gripped you, if it made your heart pound with every twist and turn, then you know there's a reason we tell these tales. They remind us that the world is a far stranger and more mysterious place than we could ever imagine. So, if you're a fan of these stories, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments below what you think of Eleanor's journey. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story, because there are a million more secrets waiting to be uncovered.